Okay, this is segment 1 for Friday, and we're going to pick up with JFK and foreign policy at the peak of the Cold War. We had discussed Camelot and a little bit about the domestic side of the Kennedy years. Now we're going to look at something that was pretty important because the Cold War during Kennedy's administration will heat up probably as hot as it ever got. And you can see here I have different images of JFK's counterpart in the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, who took over for Stalin when Stalin finally passed away. Interestingly, when Stalin passed away, one of the things Khrushchev did in the Soviet Union that came out later is that he gave a famous speech explaining to the Russian people, or at least the Russian government, how terrible Stalin had been. However, Khrushchev did follow the same expansionist foreign policy that Stalin had followed and actually pushed it further. Now, one of the things we'll see is that Khrushchev believed that Kennedy, because of his youth and inexperience, would be somebody who could be taken advantage of by the Soviet Union and would not be a formidable threat to Soviet expansion. You see him here on the bottom right. This is a famous image from a speech that he gave at the Soviet Union where he in essence said to the rest of the world, "Communism will break you. It will break capitalism." Unfortunately for Kennedy, his first foray into foreign policy was a huge failure, and it was something called the Bay of Pigs invasion. It dealt with the fact that in 1959, Cuba became a communist nation as Fidel Castro's revolution took over that island, driving out the leader at the time who the United States had supported, taking over a lot of corporations and facilities that the United States had there, and turning the nation of Cuba to communism. One of the things that America believed, and in fact under Eisenhower there was a program that was begun to try and follow through on this, was that we had a sense that most of the people in Cuba would probably not be favorable to a communist revolution, partially because of our own bias that we would think we would not want to be under the rule of communism. But whether that was true or not, what the Eisenhower administration set up towards the very end of Eisenhower's term was an invasion that was to be manned, or the people that would be involved in this invasion would be exiles from Cuba who wanted to get back in, and the United States would provide them with the material, the ships, and so forth that they would need in order to try and return to Cuba, hopefully gather support from people who hated Castro and take over and remove Castro from power. Now the problem is that as soon as Castro became a communist leader, the Soviet Union allied themselves with Cuba, and in fact the ties between the two are getting stronger with each passing week. So the United States will attempt to support this invasion and be part of it as a CIA operation, and attempt to make it look as though the U.S. is not truly involved, although all they really did was paint over the American insignia on much of the equipment that they used. The problem is that the Bay of Pigs invasion, which takes place on April 16, 1961, was something that was ready to go when Kennedy walked into the White House, and he decided to go ahead and do it. It just had not been completed and finalized by the time he came in as a result of his inauguration on January 20th, 1961. And so on April 16th, the invasion took place, and it was a total failure as the freedom fighters, as we called them, the Cuban exiles, were killed or captured. One of the big problems with was the U.S. refused to give them air cover or planes to protect them, because we didn't want to be identified with the invasion. But very quickly, Kennedy had to admit that we were behind it, as all the obvious signs were there, and to, in a sense, apologize about his first foray into foreign policy. So if you look at it in a big picture way, here's a young guy who just took over, who the Soviets and our other Cold War adversaries think is probably too young and inexperienced, and the first thing he does is make a huge mistake and have to apologize for it. One of the things about Kennedy, however, was that his ability to understand politics was pretty strong, and so not immediately, but not long after that, he gave a speech at Rice University where he in essence said, don't look down at the island of Cuba on your map, but instead look up at the sky and state the words that we chose to go to the moon. And in essence, he was announcing the space race. Now, NASA had already been created, but he definitely put forward the idea that we had a plan that we wanted to put a man on the moon and return them safely by the end of the decade of the 1960s. His view towards our issues as far as the mutual assured destruction of the nuclear weapons of the Cold War was one that was different than what Eisenhower had done. Eisenhower, in an attempt to save money and also because he didn't want to get into another war if at all possible, had come up with something called massive retaliation. And the basic idea was if the Soviets ever really threatened us, we would nuke them, and that would be the response. Kennedy and his advisors believed that this was not the right path to take, and even during the election they commented on this before Kennedy was elected and said that their view would be something different called flexible response. First, it implied the Republicans were too rigid and that the Democrats would use new technology that was available to answer the problems of the Cold War, not just blow up the world. This was the basis for using special forces and smaller units to train other nations to defend themselves against communist infiltration. And of course, this will be something that we'll see as our beginning of our investment in Vietnam. And one of the things that's interesting here is that the people that Kennedy brought in with him were young, for the most part, and idealistic, and believed that they could solve any kind of a problem. And they were brilliant men who one historian later described as, quote, the best and the brightest. And they did have a bit of an arrogant attitude about how they could fix anything and deal with any problem. And their view was that by using this flexible response idea, they could stop the spread of communism without actually having to destroy the world. So we get the Kennedy-Khrushchev face-off. Again, Khrushchev sees Kennedy as inexperienced. Now, they have a summit meeting in Vienna, and I have to really emphasize to you that during this period of time, anytime the American president and the leader of the Soviet Union met somewhere, it was a very, very big deal, because if either guy got mad, we could end up starting World War III. Well, they met in Vienna, Austria in June of 1961. The Americans were very interested in the Russians stopping the spread of communism and opening up somewhat. Kennedy pushed that in the meeting. And, of course, the Soviets were very much supporting the idea that something had to be done about West Berlin, where many of the people from East Germany who were upper class and educated were escaping to the West. Well, in the meeting, Kennedy refused to bend at all about West Berlin, and in fact he gave a speech related to this where he was in West Berlin and he said famously in German, "Ich bin ein Berliner," which means I am a Berliner, we are all supporting West Berlin as it's surrounded by communists and we will not stop supporting it. Khrushchev responded to the failure of this summit having come up with any kind of an agreement by building the Berlin Wall, and you see it here on the bottom left, the symbol of the Cold War in many ways. And as we talked about in class the other day, the Berlin Wall is built around West Berlin by the Soviets and the East Germans. And it wasn't built to try and keep the capitalist of West Berlin in. It was to keep East Berliners and other communists from escaping to the freedom of the West. And so you saw the actual wall. And so when the wall does come down in 1989, it's very symbolic of the end of communism. But again, as far as foreign policy is concerned, Kennedy really doesn't have much success here. It's looked at as another failure and a ratcheting up of the Cold War and the issues between the two nations. That leads us to the closest we ever got to blowing up planet Earth, and hopefully the closest that we ever will, which is the Cuban Missile Crisis, the so-called Missiles of October of 1962. The United States had found by its satellites and by overflights by its spy planes over Cuba that the Cubans had allowed the Soviets to come into Cuba and to put in missile installations that could fire nukes at the United States. And the proof was in photography that Kennedy was eventually brought to the American people in order to make his argument about what happened here. But they could see the missile installations going in, but there was a strong sense, and a lot of intelligence indicated, that the missiles themselves were not yet in Cuba. So Kennedy went on TV and he basically said that the United States was going to put a naval quarantine around Cuba and not allow the Soviets to bring missiles there. It was also well known to the press and to the American public that there were missiles on ships that had left the Soviet Union and were on their way to Cuba. So what occurred was a showdown. What would happen when the Soviet ships arrived at the quarantine that the American Navy had put around the island of Cuba? If firing started, it could trigger World War III. Well, the outcome of this is that we got very, very close to starting World War III, but thankfully, as the Russian ships got close to the American quarantine zone, Khrushchev and Kennedy began to negotiate through back channels and let each other know that they didn't want World War III, and the two men will actually back down in these secret negotiations. The result of these negotiations, besides calming this issue and putting it aside, at least for that point, was ultimately the creation of a direct line of communication between Moscow and Washington that would hopefully keep any kind of unwanted nuclear exchange between the two from occurring. And so that's what's known as the hotline. Now, for quite a while, it was really just what's called a teletype machine, which is sort of a typewriter that would print out information. And then during the presidency of Ronald Reagan, it was literally turned into a phone that had a line between Moscow and Washington where the two men could actually talk in order to hopefully avert an accidental exchange of nukes. The scenario, however, that played out at the time was that the U.S. was very much prepared to invade Cuba. In fact, we had much of our military down in Florida, and if you talk to anybody serving in the military at that point, they'll tell you that they really thought we were about to invade Cuba, which probably would have started World War III, because as we found out after the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union fell apart and opened up, they actually did have missiles there that we didn't know about, and the commanders on the ground in Cuba, who were Soviet, were actually given control of those weapons personally so that if they felt threatened, they could fire them. So if we had actually done anything truly aggressive towards Cuba, it probably would have started World War III, which is even closer to starting it than people had thought after this event had taken place. So it wasn't until 1989 that we really found out how really close we were to starting World War III. The Russians pull the missiles out of Cuba. We pull some missiles out of Turkey, which was part of NATO, and threatened. Those missiles were a direct threat to Moscow and the Soviet Union, and so we sort of had a quid pro quo between the two nations that calmed the issues. And the truth is that although it takes quite a while, there's a slight thawing from that point forward of the Cold War. So this is the turning point of the Cold War in many ways, in that the anger and the potential war that seemed to be on a hair trigger's edge up to that point will slowly dissipate. Now, it's going to take time, and there was always the threat of an exchange of nukes by the two sides, and a big fear of that here in the United States until finally the Soviet Union fell. All right, let's talk JFK and domestic policy. One of the things he put forward was something that really proved the idealism that his administration had, and that was something called the Peace Corps. And this is the idea that young people who got out of college, instead of going directly into the business world, would, in a sense, contribute 2 or 3 or maybe even up to 5 years of their time working in different agencies that the U.S. sent around the world to help those who were impoverished, who had problems, and whose expertise, who could benefit from the expertise that could be brought out by these American college students. Many young people were part of this. It's still an organization that exists today, and it was really in some ways the beginning of the United States becoming a much more global nation, taking advantage of the youthful idealism of the baby boom generation and continuing that process today. 1/3 of Kennedy's proposals in legislation during his term in office were for education. Doesn't get a ton of it passed, but he does a whole lot of proposals and puts forward a lot of ideas that unfortunately he was unable to complete in a potential second term, obviously, because he was assassinated. But his real plan, as it says down there at the bottom, was to pass some things in his first term, but to increase programs during his second term. A couple of other things that are important that occur: the beginning of the Medicare program, some aid to the inner cities by the federal